This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store or podchaser.com. Thank you so much for responding to my call for interviews. I've gotten a bunch of responses, but I want more, so continue those. I did want to talk about just briefly, I've had a couple of people say, well, I'm not sure my story is unique enough. And please don't think that. Everyone's story is unique, and everyone's story is going to reach other people who have had similar experiences in ways that my story or someone else's story might not. So please keep those coming. Really appreciate that. If you want to tell your story on the podcast, gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Because of the fast turnaround time, I did the edit on today's episode, so Mike got the week off. On to today's show. My guest today is Stephanie of the StephUp podcast. I was a guest on her podcast a few weeks ago, and I enjoyed my conversation with her so much that I had her on. Stephanie is a believer. She is very much in the middle of deconstruction on a number of fronts. As you're going to hear, her faith has gone through some deconstruction from a very strict Calvinist conservative theology to being a lot more open-minded, a lot more grace-oriented. Her politics have definitely been deconstructed, and she is much more open to learning about herself, learning about racism, sexism, the role of women in church, LGBTQ community. She has just become a more open and loving person, and you're going to hear that. I want to emphasize she's in the middle of this, so you're going to hear that. We often don't hear from people in the middle of that process, and so I find this conversation a fascinating one. I really appreciate Stephanie and what she's doing, trying to make change from the inside of Christianity and focus on people and loving people. Her podcast is called the StephUp Podcast. That's one word, StePhup, which is available on all the podcast platforms. She is in the works with a potential new podcast, and she is also a children's author with a book coming out called What Should Dragon Do? We will have links in the show notes for all of those projects. Here is my conversation with Stephanie. Stephanie, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and chat with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad we're reconnecting again. I wanted to thank you for having me on your podcast, the StephUp podcast. You want to give the elevator pitch of what your podcast is about?
Sure. So it's about delving into different topics to learn more about ourselves and more about others and the world around us. And I do a variety of topics. My favorite are mental health, social issues, and personal development.
Very good. And we were talking about atheism.
Yes.
And I really appreciated your take on that. You are a believer, and you were genuinely interested, and you had really good questions. And I really appreciated that. So I'm going to attempt to return the favor.
Oh, thank you.
To be just as fair. But let's start with, what was your faith tradition, or what is your faith tradition now?
So growing up, we were, I guess, called fundamentalists or evangelicals. And my parents really liked Bill Gothard. Didn't necessarily talk about Jerry Falwell too much, but the beliefs that Falwell has, the moral majority and all that kind of things, we took, like, we were also a part of that. And my dad is super into theology. So his favorite topics that he loves to argue about is six-day creation. He's a Calvinist, and he's all millennial. So he likes to fight with the post-mills and the pre-mills.
Okay.
And you know what? It's funny when you talk to certain people, like certain Christians that don't know anything about theology. If you want to sound smart, you just throw those terms around and they're
That's
like,
right.
what?
Eschatology, man.
Exactly. So I grew up hearing all that stuff.
You might have to refresh my memory on all millennial. I don't know that I remember that particular stance.
Oh,
Yeah.
so basically, they believe that Revelations was kind of what happened in 60 AD. So Nero was the mark of the beast, if I'm remembering correctly. So history is never, things get worse, things get better. Like, it's just kind of, that's how it works. So with all the people getting caught up in the, remember a few years ago, it was all about, oh, the end times, all those movies with Kirk Cameron and
Sure.
Left Behind.
Yes.
Oh, and everyone was getting all in a tizzy. It was really weird, and my dad would start arguing with people. But I appreciate that we weren't into that kind of stuff, because that kind of thinking really goes weird sometimes, and people freak out. And they're like, "We're gonna have the rapture, and then, we're gonna be standing there, and then we're gonna be gone, poof, and then you're gonna be standing left on Earth." And it was like, I'm really glad we're not into that, because that sounds really embarrassing.
Yeah, definitely. Rapture anxiety is a very real thing that I hear from people who have deconstructed, where they still feel that tension, that fear that they will be left behind.
Oh, well, yeah, for sure. I can imagine. I was also gonna say, what I appreciated about your story, that you were a part of the good side of Christianity, in the sense of you already lived with grace.
I tried, yeah.
And I grew up like, my mom is a wonderful woman, very kind, but my dad is more intense and dictatorial. Is that the right word? I can't
Dictatorial
even
is
say it.
correct, yes.
Dictatorial, thank you. In a sense, like, he's very intense. So it was more legalistic.
Got it.
It was all theology. My parents even went to this church called Grace Community, and there was no grace. Like,
Aw,
they were wanting to put everyone under authority, membership and authority, so that they could. This one guy had depression, and then they were like, "We need to put you under authority because you're depressed." It's like, wow.
yeah.
So I didn't grow up with a lot of grace. It was mostly judgment, legalism.
And pretty strict theology, it sounds like.
Yes. And when you're talking about people from the LGBTQ community, or feminists, or secular humanist, or whatever, it's dripping with hatred, or like anger, or like the homosexuals. That's literally
Yeah.
how it was.
Okay. When did you start to question maybe the correctness of all of that?
Well, I'm a highly sensitive person, so I've always been more empathetic. So for me, it was always hard. And you know what? They say, well, we need a balance of truth and love. And I was always like, well, I'm more the love. My dad's more the truth. So I was always told, you need to be telling people the truth, and kind of like fighting. He wouldn't say fight, but like get in there and tell people kind of off.
Mhm. Right.
And I was more on the side of like, I just want to be friends with people and love people.
Yeah.
But coming from a very judgmental background, it was also, I didn't know how to love people because I just had to judge them. I used to watch soap operas, so I got judged for that in church. But before I started watching them, we would judge other people who watch soap operas. Like, you shouldn't be watching soap operas.
Right.
So, but for me, that was really hard. And I grew up in the Christian school up until grade 9. Then I went to a secular high school, and I had friends who were not Christians, and it was really shocking.
Yeah.
But I was also scared, and I was shy and scared of talking to people, because it was all, in those days, you had to convert people.
Right.
Like, are you telling everybody about Jesus? And it was so embarrassing because I was so scared, and people started hating Christians, and I was like, I don't know what to say. And then I have actually, over the years, I've got a lot of gay friends.
Yeah.
And in, what was it, 2002 or 2001 or something, my friend from grade 9, she and I had a huge fight because I told her it was wrong to be gay. And my Christian friends were like, you shouldn't be friends with her because she's gay. And a few years later, I felt so bad, and I apologized to her, and she's one of my best friends now. Like, we're still friends.
Yeah.
And the Christian people who said I shouldn't be friends with her, like, we had a falling out, and they're not my friends.
Right.
So I've always struggled with it. And I think I've heard from a lot of your podcasts with people you've talked to, where they also, I think it was Daniel from When Belief Dies, where
Yeah.
he was saying feminism and LGBTQ issues have always been you don't want to believe what Christians are supposed to believe, that it's all wrong, and that you have to judge people and be like, well, you're going to hell because of this. That was always so hard for me.
I've been fascinated by many of my guests who have talked about even being children and kind of recognizing a moral perspective of needing to love people, and that their church, their particular tradition wouldn't kind of allow that for certain people. And I think you and I talked on your podcast that, it's hard to hate someone when you are actually in a relationship. When you have a friend who is gay and you're told by your church that that's not acceptable, it's hard to hate that person because you begin to love them. You actually care about them as a human being. You see that they are a good person, that they don't have horns growing out of their heads, and you begin to change. That begins to change you, right?
Yeah.
So this sounds like this was your experience, that you were starting to open up who you were able to love.
I just have a comment about that actually. You know how everyone uses the terminology from Romans where they choose, men chose, or I can't remember the wording. And so Christians say you chose this lifestyle. And my one friend, she's literally crying in front of me. I'm sorry, I get teary eyed
It's okay.
when I
Yeah.
talk about these things. And she said, I would never choose this. She's like, I always, my whole life, I wish to be normal. That's what she said. Why would I choose to be abnormal? Why would I choose to be in this lifestyle where people are beaten and made fun of and just put down all the time? And that really impacted me. And so when I hear people use that term, I think it's very I understand why. Like I come from this understanding. I get it why they say that, but it shows an ignorance. And also, like, have you actually talked to anyone who was from the LGBTQ community?
Right.
Have you sat and cried with them? Have you heard their story? If you did, I don't think you'd be so just saying these words like you think you know exactly what's going on, right?
Right. So it sounds like we're about high school age at this point for you. What happens next? Are you participating in church? Are you doing ministry in any way, lay ministry, that kind of thing?
I went to Bible college
Okay.
out in Saskatchewan for a year. I'm in Canada. I have to tell people what provinces are.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
um, the church I grew up with was pretty snotty. And I was thinking, I don't want to go back here. So I was I stopped going. I was just trying to hang out with my coworkers, and it was kind of fun, just backsliding. and then I and then I went back to a church. I went to this prosperity church
Ooh. Okay.
that was under like a Kenneth Copeland. He was like their leader type. But I went there because I they were very loving
Right.
and I felt accepted. But then after a year of being there, I'm like, the theology was, I'm like, no, this is wrong. Then I went to a Pentecostal church, but just a normal Pentecostal, not not like a wacky one, right?
I've been to both kinds. So.
I don't even know how to explain it to people. And I tend to use these words that you really shouldn't use, like crazy or wacky, but I don't know how else to explain it. But just really cool people and just more fun, I guess. I always thought Pentecostals were more fun, but I've heard from some of your guests that some of it is more extreme, which I thought would be more like Brethren, where you can't wear pants and stuff like that. I was like, oh, I didn't know Pentecostals could be like that. But
Yeah, it can be. One of the faith traditions that led into Pentecostalism was the holiness movement, way back to like Wesley. But that became very legalized, legalistic, and
mhm.
you can't roller skate, you can't play cards, you can't go to the theater.
Oh, those are funny.
Yeah, yeah, that type of thing.
So I loved it. I was part of the worship team, and it was really great. Then I moved to Toronto and I went to Christian University.
Okay.
And I was going to study psychology and I switched over to philosophy. I was 30 at this point and my dad was like, "Wow, he was so concerned about me taking philosophy at a Christian university."
Right.
But he
Yeah.
kept going on about this one course he took in the 70s where they were comparing Christianity to LSD trip where like it's the same as a spiritual experience as taking drugs. So that was the only really relevant thing or the only thing that he could think of that philosophy was. And I was like, what? There's more to it than that. But I took critical thinking and that was the hardest course I ever took, but the best.
Okay.
But I couldn't get my brain around it because I'd grown up always being told what to think, what to do.
Right.
and you couldn't even ask questions. Now, I know that's not all Christian backgrounds, but for me, if you ask a question, you just get this runaround and like you get talked at. You don't really, there's no dialogue.
Right.
So I don't know. I've kind of been off and on sometimes where I go through really great experiences with church, and then others where I just the last church I went to in Toronto. I mean, I really loved it. I was on the worship team, but I just saw this like, the worship leader's up there worshiping God, and then she's yelling at her kids, and then when we were hanging out in the back during the second service, they're just on their phones giggling and like, "Oh, did you watch Game of Thrones?" And I'm thinking, we're the freaking worship leaders, and we act like we're teenagers. These are grown adults. I just thought it was weird. And I stepped down from worship because I said to the worship pastor, I'm like, I don't feel, I'm not, what I'm singing, I'm not living. And I felt
Ah.
like a hypocrite.
You know the saying that Christians don't tell lies, they sing them.
Yeah, like I surrender all. Like, do we actually? None of us actually surrender all.
Yeah.
But really, it was this whole thing with Trump
Okay.
and the pandemic and when George Floyd died. I wanted to learn about racism. I wanted to understand because we grew up in very conservative and everything. You have to listen to, Candace Owens. You have to listen to Charlie Kirk and Dennis Prager and Ben
Wow.
Shapiro, and what they say is true. And so I started looking outside it. And I'm sorry if I hope it's okay that I call out these names.
No, please.
Those are just the names I constantly hear.
They have no sympathy for me, so okay.
And I just would believe, oh, like, oh, Ben Shapiro, he sounds really smart. Okay, yeah, he's so right. And then I started questioning and I started watching different progressive Christian YouTubers,
Yeah.
atheist Christian, and I started hearing, they were talking about some of the stuff that we believe and some of the stuff that we say. Love the sinner, hate the sin. They're like, you don't understand how condescending that sounds. And I was like, oh,
Right.
right, because growing up in the Christian world, you just say these things. You don't understand what it sounds like, and to other people, they're like, it sounds like you're in a cult. So I just started questioning a lot of this, and I hate the fundamentalists that I grew up in. Like, why is it that we can't accept that people are worthy of being people and worthy of love, and why are we so hateful towards? And I know I don't want to generalize. There's so many amazing Christians who do love people, but
Sure.
my background, and even in the church I saw many amazing people, but just a lot of my background was just such judgment, and it was so hard, and I still see it, and it makes me sad. Honestly,
Right.
I cry when I start thinking of the different of the, I look back at things I've said to some of my gay friends or some of my atheist friends, or like, and I'm like, oh, cringy. And I asked my friend, I said to her, because she knew me back since grade 9, and I said, oh man, was I this bad? She goes, you weren't like that all the time. You were fun. Because I said, how could you stand me?
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, well, you're still my friend, so it must have been okay.
And I want to say, you don't have to defend. This is your experience, right? So you're describing your experience, and I think we, the audience, understand you're not trying to say all Christians. You're saying your experience of Christianity at that point. So
Right.
I also want to give you an opportunity, though, to talk about what you find fulfilling and meaningful in your relationship with God.
I've actually wondered if I ever could not believe in God. The thing is, with God, I guess the experience of it, and maybe it is just maybe it isn't real. Because you said, how can you know absolutely sure? We can't absolutely be sure because we can't see God, and we're still alive, so we can't see what's beyond death. Growing up, it was always like, no, this is the truth,
Right.
and that's just what it is. So I thought that was really interesting when I heard you say that, because I was like, yeah, that is really self-righteous of us to assume that we know for sure, because we can't really know for sure.
Right.
But for me, I think I just, when I see, and I know this isn't really a really good argument for God, but when I just look at how things are just so, like how the body works, I just can't really believe that it's such an, like it has no meaning, and there, or not that it has no meaning, but it's just like there was nothing, there was nothing higher than us to,
Sure.
that for me, I think would always trip me up if I were, also my experiences. And yeah, it is comforting to believe that there's something higher out there.
Really, I want to be very clear here, Stephanie. That is honest, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. You'd be amazed, though, when I have some believers on, they feel the weight of needing to defend instead of just being honest. And you're being honest, and I really appreciate that. So,
Well, I owe that to you and to a lot of the people I've learned from, because I was that person, which gave me a lot of anxiety because I'm not good at arguing, and it takes away the pressure.
right.
I hated that pressure to defend everything. I'm like, well, how do you know there's a God? And how do you? And I was like, I don't. I'm not good at this. And so to not have to go around, and I used to be scared of meeting non-Christians because I was supposed to convert them, and I was like terrified, and I was like, this is not fun. I can't just have a normal conversation with a non-Christian.
Yeah.
It was just horrible, and it created more anxiety, and I was already anxious.
So you had taken a critical thinking class that was pretty important and profound for you, and you began with some of the politics, the Trump world, that kind of thing. Are there elements of the version of Christianity you grew up with that you have discarded?
Well, and I've tried talking to my mom about this, but she still believes that women should not be leaders. I've changed my viewpoint on that. Okay, so growing up, you, and it was so, it wasn't outrightly stated, but women were treated like second class citizens.
Mhm.
I mean, I basically believed I was only good for like, you had to get married in the Christian, in the church. If you're 22 and you're single, you're an old maid. I found that really obnoxious. But it was kind of like, really, yeah, you should go to school and get a job, in case you don't find anyone and can't be a stay at home mom. But that was really what you should be doing, because that's the greatest thing you can do is raise your kids. And I've seen people live like that, and they're stuck because they don't have a job or education, and their husband's actually abusive because they got married thinking he was a Christian, and now they have nothing and they're relying on them. I've seen this so many times, and it makes me so angry. So I am now a feminist, and in a family, well, I've had great discussions with my mom, but feminism is an evil liberal thing according
Ah.
to my father. So everything liberal is like the evil liberals. He'll even pray like, we can't let the evil liberals. And I'm like, whoa, this is just so insane. Like, why are you so angry, first of all? And if you're a Calvinist and you believe in the sovereignty of God, wouldn't you just be like, well, God's in control? If the liberals get in, the liberals get in. Like, don't freak about it. Right? Isn't it kind of hypocritical?
That is an excellent point. Yes. Somehow that idea seems to have escaped the conservative Calvinists.
Oh. Okay, so I was going through an angry, even when you and I spoke, I was still pretty angry.
Okay.
I don't want to be in that space,
Sure.
but I needed to. I think we all kind of go through an angry phase when we're challenging some of these things. But I want to, and you're very inspiring because you want to live with grace, and I love that. And I've been just on my podcast, I interview a lot of life coaches and stuff, and I'm just learning so much about the attitude we should have and how we should treat people and have, and I'm like, I want to live like this. But the thing that bothers me, and there's some amazing Christians who have grown and they're into personal development, But for us, it was always like, you can't, oh, you shouldn't read The Secret because it's Eastern religion. You shouldn't talk so much about being an awesome person. Even in youth group, this guy in our youth group said awesome. He's like, that's awesome. And it was like, you shouldn't say awesome because only God is awesome. Like all that craziness.
Yeah.
And yoga and like I started doing Tai Chi to because I've been doing physio and she suggested that. That kind of thing was always evil. And saying that you're a good person or like I'm awesome, like that was looked upon as bad. But and I remember I wanted to grow as a person and I would pray and read my Bible and I'm like, Holy Spirit, how do I get the fruits of the Spirit and how do I be more like this? And the church a lot of times, depending on the church and the people, will think that you only if you do take counseling, it should be a Christian counselor only.
Right.
My last life coach, he was not a Christian, but he was like the best. He was amazing, and I'm so glad I worked with him. I just learned so much from different people, and I've grown, and this was always what I wanted. So I feel like the church needs to step up and say, it's okay. It's okay to think that you have potential. It's okay to meditate, like deep breathing. If you believe that meditation is bad and you don't, you can meditate. You don't have to do it in an Eastern religion way if you don't want to. But if you believe that God created us, then God created deep breathing. Like what's so wrong with that? But I mean, you must have heard that kind of stuff too, right? Where it's like,
Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. That.
and I hate that. It stopped me from growing because I'm like, I can't watch that or listen to that. That's bad. That bothers me.
Yeah, I guess so. I think for me personally, the legalism always seemed paper thin because just like you were saying, the worship team, talking about Game of Thrones and stuff, it was selective. All right, what a person was legalistic about could change over time, would change based on the group you were with, and so I always had kind of a very bad, as a Christian, a very poor perspective on people who were very legalistic. So, thus the grace, right? That was what attracted me.
My favorite thing was I started watching The Walking Dead. Now I
Uh,
stopped because it just got kind of boring, but not because I felt bad about it.
right.
But it was so good, right? I don't know if you watched it,
The
but
Yeah, the first few seasons, yeah.
yeah. And then Rick left, like, I mean, there's only two of them left, Daryl and Carol, the two originals, right?
Oh, okay, okay.
And I used to watch Supernatural. I don't know if you with Dean and Sam Winchester.
I didn't particularly watch that one, but yeah.
And I remember this was back when we bought DVDs. I bought the DVDs for Supernatural. And then Sam and like he drinks demon's blood. And then there's there's a lot of Christian things, but also other religions, and it's a fun show. But I remember struggling so much. And then I sold the DVDs. And then I bought them back. And then I sold them. I kept going back and forth
Yes.
because I was like, no, I shouldn't be watching this. It's wrong. And when I started watching The Walking Dead, and I posted on Facebook about it or something, and people were like, I got I got my some people it's like, Stephanie, you should
Right.
you shouldn't be watching zombies. And I said, well, you know what? They've even written books about Christianity and The Walking Dead and how there's, the apocalypse and stuff like that. But I'm like, chill, it's science fiction. Like, would you freak out at me watching a Marvel movie?
Yeah.
I mean, really, what's the big deal? And Twilight, I remember struggling with that. It's a vampire. Should I be liking Twilight? I mean, I shouldn't
Right.
like it just because it's pretty bad, but but I loved it when it came out, and I
Yeah.
struggled with it, and I was like, "Why is this such a bad thing? So what? It's a vampire."
The thing for me that I found interesting is when I was younger and in the church, it was all about, secular music is bad, secular music is bad. And I started to notice, the adults would listen to, whatever the contemporary music was, the kind of the older music from a decade earlier that was secular. That was okay. And, so as time goes on, right, if you're listening to adult contemporary, that's fine. That's okay. That's but like current modern music, like that the kids are listening to, that's evil.
Oh, and you can listen to Alice Cooper because he's a Christian now.
Yeah.
That's fine. Or do you
Yeah.
remember when he dressed? Oh, when Pat Boone. Do you remember? And then he was on one of the music award shows, and he dressed up like Alice Cooper, and Alice Cooper was supposed to come out dressed like Pat Boone, and he refused. And Christian, like, I think that's when Pat Boone just kind of like disappeared because Christians berated him. How
Yeah.
dare you dress up? And he was like, it was a joke.
Yeah.
Like, just that kind of stuff is so weird. Like, chill.
So one other topic that and you can say no, by the way, if you don't want to get into this, but you've talked a little bit about being single in the church and kind of the weight of purity culture. You want to talk about that a little bit about what that was like for you and what could the church do better for people who are single?
Yeah, I don't mind at all. I think it's important to talk about these things. So I'm 41, turning 42 soon. It's weird. I don't feel it, You're like, "Wait, I was just 20." Yeah, I actually did a episode with my friend on my podcast on singleness,
Okay.
especially within the church. Now, she lives in Europe, but she's American. So we were talking about the difference because in America, I mean, or North America, we're kind of similar
Sure.
anyways.
Americas. Yeah, there you go.
It's very individualistic, which of course you see with everyone fighting against wearing a mask, and
Yeah.
it's all about me rather than the collective, like
Right.
everyone else. But she said, so when you're in the church, a lot of churches, most churches, I've been to a few, so I've seen it pretty much everywhere. But you got the groups, and yeah, you can have a cell group with different people, and they get to know each other, and that's great. But there's still a divide. So when I was younger, in my early 20s, you're in the college and career, and that's fine. But then you see your friends start getting married. Then a year later, they have babies, and they're not really your friend anymore as much. Like, they say
Right.
hi to you, but you've lost that person. So you're the single, and then you turn 30. Then the church doesn't know what to do with you, so they put you in the college and career. But there's 22-year-olds, so you're like, well, I mean, they're fun, but I'm in a different place in my life,
Sure.
and it's just weird. And I want to be friends with the people my age, but they're all married with young children. And if I'm not like goo goo gaga over their kids, then I really have no connection with them. And I think maybe that was part of the reason why I started not going to church so much in my later 30s, because I just felt a disconnect and I had more fun with my coworkers.
Right.
So, and also it's weird because I remember at church, I guess it depended who you found to talk to, but it was always, hi, how are you? I'm good. How are you? How was your week? It was great. Good. Okay. Do you want to talk about anything else? Like, there's not a lot of deepness going on, which I hate small talk. As an introvert, I hate it.
Yeah.
I'd rather talk like you and I are talking. I
Yeah.
mean, if you and I could go to church together, I'd be like, David, let's have a good old chat.
Yeah.
And my friend, she said in Europe, it's a little bit different where they're more of, it doesn't matter if you're single or with family. There's more of a group
Right.
mentality. So, and my mom said, well, it's not like that at my church. But I talked to another woman who's in her 30s and single, and she goes, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's hard because if you're not married when you're 21, 22, and my sister got married when she was 22, 23, I think, and she felt old.
Wow.
And so, I'm glad I didn't get married back then. I almost married a guy. He was an emotional abuser, and I met him when I dated him for on and off for 5 years, and I met him when I was 30. But I was so obsessed with being with somebody because that was my identity. I was like, I have to
Right.
get married. The problem, I think, is that the church puts so much emphasis on family, focus on the family, right?
Right.
And yeah, they on focus on the family. They used to have like single people talking, but it, it's not really like they get it.
there's social pressure, implied or explicit, that you need to get married, that you have to build a family, or there's something wrong.
Yeah, and I went to a church where the pastor literally this was that charismatic prosperity church, and he said, if you're married and you don't have children, that's very selfish. I'm thinking, well, you don't even know what people, maybe they can't have children.
Yeah,
You ever think about that? Like,
yeah.
you've just literally broken their heart because you said that. That's an assholey move. Sorry, can I swear?
Yes, you can express yourself. Yes.
So I just think it's really hard. And I mean, yeah, maybe I'd like to get married. I don't, it's not this insane desire I have though, which I had before. It
Right.
was like this, I must get married, and I was obsessed with it. That was awful. I'm content with who I am, and I love it.
Fantastic. Yes.
And if I had married somebody at that age, it would have been somebody like my list was so bad. It was like he has to be a creationist. He has to be Calvinist because this is what I grew up. I don't
Right.
even care anymore. Like, I don't care if you're younger or older. Like, whatever. I mean, it doesn't bother me, but he'd have to get past my dad.
That could be quite a challenge.
I had a crush on this guy. I think I was 35, and my parents were involved in this company and they met him, and my dad's like, "You can't like him." I was like, "Why?" And he goes, "He's an old earth," or my dad likes to say, theistic evolutionist. He doesn't use old earth.
Okay. Right.
And I was like, "Okay." So I can't have a crush on this guy who didn't really even know I existed, but uh I'm 35. And I can't have a crush on this guy because he's
Yeah.
not six-day creationist. What?
Wow.
It's so weird. But I just wish that we were just more people. Like, just instead of putting us in these categories and groups and putting so much focus on, oh, your family, oh, your children, and oh, this, just put an emphasis on people.
Right.
Is that so hard? I don't know.
Now, definitely, I think this is what I appreciate about your podcast and what you're doing, and I continue to encourage you that to be a voice inside, right? To make change, to recognize that it is about caring for people. That's really the important thing, and even you mentioned the example of masks. I'm fascinated watching conservative Christians argue about not wearing a mask. And I think, have you read the Good Samaritan story? Have you,
Oh,
like there's just like, which Jesus are you following? Because
oh.
that is not what I read.
Well, that's one thing I appreciate. Like, I was looking for a church, and I started going back to this church I used to go to when I was in kindergarten.
Okay.
um, and during the pandemic, we would watch online because we were shut down, right?
Yeah.
Lockdown. And the pastor was just reasonable, rational. And he's like, we're following guidelines. And he was telling people, like, you know, people can get caught up in the QAnon stuff and all this. And he goes, be careful. Like, I was like, oh, thank you. Because I was
Yeah.
getting so sick of, I guess if you're on Facebook too long, you just think like all conservative Christians are anti-mask, anti-vaccine, and wanting their church to be open. I just got really mad and frustrated with people.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that bothered me the most was all the stuff that was coming out. I was learning about racism, and I know, when you're learning things and then you assume other people also understand
Yeah.
or that they should have the same awareness as you. But I was just seeing so much anger over church being closed when you literally have Zoom and face, like, it's not so bad. There are alternatives. We don't
Right.
live in the 1800s. And yet they didn't, nothing, nothing really about caring about what's happening.
Yeah.
Or if they are, they're against what it is because they're conservative and they're listening to Ben Shapiro, who says there's no such thing as systemic racism. That kind of thing was bothering me because I'm like,
Yes.
wait, why does it have to be you're conservative and you're saying, not that all conservatives say this, I'm just,
I understand.
but why does it have to be like this? And then liberals are believing like, well, blah 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 blah, and I'm like, well, maybe it's more complicated than this. I don't think people are saying this or this necessarily. Most people are just trying to have a rational discussion, but of course, those people are the loudest on each side. And that's just what we see all the time on the media. It's frustrating.
Yeah, I talk about a lot that I lost my objectivity when Trump came along. I used to kind of still have a bridge to conservatives. I could, I could communicate. And I feel like that's gone now, where there's such a gulf between, and this has nothing to do with Christianity, but just that conservative mindset in general. I find it harder and harder to maintain communication across that gulf.
Well, and it's interesting too because it's like, okay, so you like Trump because abortion, I guess. That's what I keep hearing from everyone. But you're okay with him. They just want to bypass all the other stuff he said and
Right.
done, and the way he treats women and the way he treats people in general, and the way he tweets. Like, you can bypass all that, and that's fine. Like, that's weird,
Yes.
right? And he's like some messiah to some people.
The compartmentalization for sure. So, yeah.
Oh, another thing I wanted to mention that also really bothered me is I guess going back to the treatment of women, the purity culture I grew up in, and I used to say this, like you say, I was wrong for what I used to say and believe.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, cringe. We used to believe that if a woman's raped, well, what was she wearing? Well, was she drinking? Because it's her fault, right? Or if she divorces her husband, she shouldn't have divorced him. And it's really opened my eyes to see. And I'm a woman. Like, I should be a feminist. I
Yes.
mean, I can't believe I used to believe this stuff, but what happens in the church a lot of times, and you see this time and time again, is the woman will get kind of shamed or blamed or not believed, and then the pastor, he apologizes. Oh yeah, I had an affair, she was 15, but oh well. And then they put him back in leadership, or they just quietly, they don't go to the police, they just quietly let him go, and he goes off to another church. And I'm actually talking about starting a podcast with this other guy. He is a pastor, and he also has the same kind of passion for the voices of women, and we want to have women come on and share their stories
Mm-hmm.
of sexual abuse, so that they can, because when you talk about things, if they want to, obviously, you
Right.
have to be wanting to share that. That's hard to do, but it's healing, because I find talking and having the podcast is healing for me, but also to help others. And when that stuff came out about Ravi Zacharias, I loved Ravi. Like, I went to his conferences. I was all up about apologetics. And at first I didn't believe it. I'm like, no, not Ravi. He was like one of the ones that, no, right?
Right.
And then the truth comes out. And I was like, wow. But the fact that we don't believe women,
Hmm.
there were women, and the comments online bothered me, I'm like, no, Ravi he never confessed.
Yeah.
He actually countersued the woman, Lorianne Thompson. Anyways, but why don't we believe the women?
Yeah.
It always comes back to, well, she's lying. And I think Christians should, at least if we believe what we believe, then we should be the ones going, no, we believe her.
Right. And good for you, Stephanie, because clearly you've looked up to Ravi, and to be able to acknowledge, to hear the truth, right? Just to accept that, what the evidence says and what the women are saying is a big deal, right? You were able to change your mind there. And that's what we want. What we want is people to be able to believe the victims, hear what the actual evidence is, and then make a decision, and not just dismiss it as, well, this can't be true.
Right. Because he's a good man. He's our Christian leader.
Exactly.
Well, that's another thing we do. It's a tendency we all have to do, right? Revere people.
Yeah.
But and I was the same. Like, when I met Ravi, I was like, oh, it's Ravi. Can I get your autograph? But why do we do that? They're people. And time again, we've seen leaders fall because they got too big.
Yes. Yeah.
They think they're so wonderful, and there's no accountability, and then of course it's a huge downfall.
Yeah, and not to diminish the culpability, but that's also an impossible standard for pastors and evangelists to live up to as well. And so, I
Right.
mean, it is all designed to come to tears, right? All of it is designed to break human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Stephanie, I want to switch gears really quick. You had asked me in an email, but I want to frame it as religion versus relationship.
Right.
And you were talking about even if the arguments aren't the thing that convinces you, what about that relationship?
Right.
I get the sense that that's what is meaningful for you, that it is the relationship part. I don't want to put words in your mouth. So,
That was the thing that's most appealing,
yeah.
although hard to do because sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't want to read my Bible. I don't want to pray. And I think there's also a huge shaming that comes with that, which also bothers me because if you don't spend time with God, then you're, oh, are you walking with God? But, anyways, yeah, I think that's the most appealing part. Rather, I mean, more so than the theology, anyways, for me.
Okay. And then you were asking me what my perspective was on my former like spiritual experiences or my former relationship, as it were.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm overwhelming here. I don't want to. I don't want to just unload. But I had mentioned to you when we chatted on your podcast about the "I was mistaken" post that I made, and I'm just going to quote that really quick. Years after my deconversion and after study, I now have the words to describe what was going on in my head when I believed: attribution, community knowledge, confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance. But really, it is much simpler and clearer to say I was mistaken. The point that I wanted to make is that I had a very real sense of that. I have a relationship with God. God is real. God is outside of me in some way. And I came to believe over time that that was not the case, that it was meaningful. It was rich, but it was inside my own head. And that sounds really reductionist and and lame, but in many ways that was my experience. But that word attribution, I've plugged this a few times on the podcast. Brian Peck hosted a Life After God episode that had Carolyn Golden, who is a clinical psychologist, and she talked about this idea of attribution. And the point of that is that as human beings, we experience awe. Awe is natural. That's something we do. It's just the same as when you go out to the mountains or to the ocean, you experience awe. But we are in a society where we are told that anything that is awe inspiring, just like you said, saying it's awesome, is directed as God. God is awesome. And so any time that we experience awe, we attribute that to God.
Right.
And basically for me, what took place was recognizing that I'm experiencing awe, but that isn't necessarily external from me. It's not necessarily a spiritual being that is causing that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is particularly true. And I may have mentioned this in one of the previous episodes, but I think I told the story about my mom going to the dentist and coming back
Right.
just high as a kite.
Yeah.
Jesus talked to me. And I was like, Mom, you had painkillers. You were, that was a moment for me where I was like, oh, maybe this isn't as rock solid as I thought it was.
And also, and people have asked me this and I never knew how to respond, but when people are having psychotic breaks, they're like, God, talk to me.
Right.
How is that different than me saying, God, talk to me? Actually, it was really interesting in your interview with John Steingard. Okay, there was two stories he told. The one that got me, I guess it was combined. What got me was when he was talking about when he was in this other country I think he was doing a documentary
Yeah.
and the pygmies. Ugh, yeah, I started crying because, yeah, and I guess this is also something that really apologists can't really ever explain, or I think we always used to just say, well, God's hand is in it somewhere. I don't know. But these kids who were lost their parents and they have no way to survive and they're found in the woods, and like what a 4-year-old was taking care of a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
And and I've heard this. I've said this myself. Like, oh, I prayed and there was a parking spot, or oh, I prayed and this, and it really made me cringe because I did go to the churches where, yeah, pray for this and God will give it to you, and that was more the prosperity thinking, which has such problems with it, and it's sad how people will interpret that,
Yeah.
and it's all about me, like what can I get out of this, rather than, hey, if you do make money, hey, instead of being like, oh, well, God gave me this fancy house and this car, which is fine if you want that, but maybe do something with it. You can do more than just wish for like be Kenneth Copeland and wish for a jet, your own plane. I mean, yeah, if you want that,
Yes.
that's fine, I guess, but also do something for other people. I mean, why isn't that talked about as much? So that story really got to me. I was on a walk when I listened to that, and I was just like, oh.
Yeah, John tells it really well. If you haven't seen it yet, he has a documentary film about 5 minutes long that's
Mm.
worth seeing. It will also break your heart,
I could talk to you forever.
though. Stephanie, I really appreciate you being on the podcast, and more than that, I appreciate to use a Christianese thing. I appreciate your heart. I know your heart is in the right place, and you are trying to love people, and I love that. And I think you're going to be a change agent within Christianity. I want to give you an opportunity to plug all your work. So the Step Up podcast, any other projects you're working on. You mentioned possibly a new podcast.
Yeah, so my podcast is StephUp Podcast. My website is stephuppodcast.com, and on Instagram I'm stephup_podcast. I got too many social media handles.
We'll put some
Uh,
links in the show notes too. So
and I got a children's book coming out probably in a month or so. It's just kind of in the final stages. It's called What Should Dragon Do? And it's my
cool.
experience living with roommates. And I had this one roommate who was just, and I mean, I was a mess too. So I yelled at people too, but it was just so funny. And the tiniest thing, she would just write notes about it and like, do this and that and get mad at people for everything. So I was like, hey, that'd make a funny book. So I thought it would be a funny children's book. So that's coming out.
Awesome.
And the website for that is stephanieannweb.com. So that's going to be my main website when I get it all figured out.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, and I'm just in works talking with this pastor from Virginia, and we want to do a podcast. We're trying to figure out a name. I don't want to use the word victims. I want to use the word more like survivor,
Yeah.
because you don't have to be you don't want to stay a victim. You want to, that term kind of, yeah, they are victims, but they don't want to be seen as a victim, so it's tricky, right?
Yeah.
But a place to give women a voice when they've been, and I don't know how far we want to go, if we want to go outside of sexual abuse, but at least start with that within the church and be able to share their story. So we're kind of working on that right now.
Awesome.
So I'm really excited because that's really my passion. I've decided, when you're trying to find your passion and you're not sure, and then I just have a heart. I've always had a heart for young women, because as a teenager, I just thought so low of myself that I was worthless. And I was like, I want to help people. And then now finding out more about sexual abuse and abuse within the church, especially, is awful. Because in the church, there's more of a stigma, rather than in the world, there's less now because of the Me Too movement, but still, it's still there. But the church still has much more to catch up on.
I don't know if you caught my conversation with Jeffrey Wallace, he was specifically talking about Jehovah's Witnesses, but the
Yes.
idea applies, where he was talking about victims of abuse then have to choose between their community, everybody they've ever known, friends, family, churches, what have you, and being around the abuser, or leaving. And that's a Sophie's choice that nobody should ever have to be in.
Oh, yeah, I did hear that one. That was really good. Oh. Your episodes are very powerful and thought provoking, and I really appreciate that. I'm so glad I found you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Is
Glad I
that
found you
fate?
too. Stephanie, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Final thoughts on the podcast. I really appreciate Stephanie's honesty. We definitely didn't get the defensiveness that we most often hear from believers. I actually feel bad that when I brought up the topic of our email exchange, it really felt like I was leading the question there. And the context of the email makes a lot more sense. I really wasn't just attacking Stephanie or trying to dissuade her of her faith. It was the continuation of a conversation we had already had, some of which you could hear on my episode on her podcast, And you're just going to have to take my word for it. Hopefully, Stephanie will back me up that I accurately was conveying the conversation from the email. But I appreciate her honesty of describing some doubt, describing that she could be wrong, she could be mistaken. That is just amazing, especially coming from a background where apologetics were really important to her. She found apologetics to be convincing and useful. There isn't any of that defensiveness. As you could hear, she is in the middle of the deconstruction process on a number of fronts. She's very much learning about racism, about sexism, about the limitation of the role of women in the church. I really appreciated her talking about being single in the church. That is a topic that does not get talked about enough. The expectation of getting married and becoming a family is so strong and so heavily influences young people in their 20s that many people jump into a marriage that they never should be in. I appreciated the honesty that Stephanie described about the burden of relationship. So even when we were talking about the best part of Christianity for her, the relationship with God, she talked about the shame of not reading the Bible enough, of not praying enough. I thought we really got to something there. That was real honesty. And I think that many, many believers feel that. And I really did mean it when I said that Stephanie's heart is all in the right place. And hearing John Steingard's story about Uganda really affected her, and recognizing that the petty prayers of, I want a parking spot or I need to find my keys, don't compare to the real suffering that is in the world, that we need to love people. That is the highest calling. Thank you, Stephanie, for being on the podcast. Thank you for having me on your podcast. Thank you for being so honest and vulnerable and telling us about where you are at in discovering the truth. You are asking all the right questions, and I encourage you to continue on that journey. Thank you. Rather than a secular grace thought of the week, although it kind of is anyway, I actually want to talk to believing pastors who are very unlikely to ever be hearing this. So, but if you know a believing pastor, send them this part of the episode. You heard Stephanie's story about a person who is trying very hard to live out Christianity. And she was honest about the flaws, and she was honest about her struggles, and she was honest about hypocrisy. She was honest about being abandoned as a single person. And she's still a believer. If you're a pastor, you should be glued to this episode. You should be taking notes and figuring out how you can care for people like Stephanie within the church. She pointed out a pastor recently was integrous in talking about following CDC guidelines and dissuading his congregants from QAnon conspiracies. So that for sure is the top of priority. But caring for people who are single and not seeing them as other than or not living up to the Christian standard is also of utmost priority. Her focus on reaching out to women who have experienced sexual abuse is also a really important topic. The church needs to acknowledge where it has been wrong, where leaders have been abusers and they need to be removed, and that needs to be done very quickly and efficiently. And anytime leaders are allowed to continue because they are let off the hook, that is damaging to all of the survivors of that abuse. So ironically, this is some pastoral advice from an atheist. Listen to Stephanie's story, learn from it, take notes, care for people. That actually is secular grace. You all did respond, so I have a number of interviews coming up. I'm very excited about those, so we should have a number of Deconversion Anonymous episodes on the way. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.